Thank you for joining this webinar on the state responses to extremism in post-authoritarianism in Southeast Asia. This is actually a research report of one of the working groups in the Policy Research Network initiated by CSIS and GRIPS in Japan, National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, and RSIS, Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. So we are delighted to have this first webinar in the series of the working groups under the PRN initiated by the three organizations. And today we are going to have 5 speakers, and because they are representing topics relevant to each of the countries of the researchers. Before we start, I'd like to remind participants in Japan or others, we are going to have interpreters, so you can use the interpretation button down at the Zoom screen. That is going to be a translation from English to Japanese and Japanese to English, if you wish to use that service of interpretation. Now I'd like to invite for the opening remarks, first by Jusuf Wanandi, Vice Chairman, Board of Trustees of CSIS Foundation. Pak Yusof, screen is yours.
Thank you, Moderator. On behalf of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar on state response to extremism in post-authoritarianism in Southeast Asia. The webinar is part of the Policy Research Network of Contemporary Southeast Asia, or PRN-SEA project, under the cooperation of the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, or GRIPS, in Japan, the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Indonesia, and the Rajaratnam School of International Studies, or RSCS, of the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. The Contemporary Southeast Asia Policy Research Network aims to first build a network of policy research to address the challenges faced in Southeast Asia, and second, conduct joint policy researches on topics of common interest to each country, and raise issues or provide policies proposals to the governments concerned. The Southeast Asian region occupies an important position in the global economy. It is also located in a strategically important area in the junction between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Thus, the region's changes have great impact to the stability and prosperity on a global scale. Furthermore, the region's geographical importance is increasing amid the growing tension between the US-China relations. Meanwhile, the Southeast Asian countries face various challenges, both domestically in many of the states and also in the region. PRN-SEA, through the research clusters, aims to provide policy proposals through research in order to strengthen intellectual exchanges between Japan and Southeast Asia countries in the policy areas covered by its research clusters. This research cluster on state responses to extremism and post-authoritarianism in Southeast Asia, with 5 members from Japan, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Singapore, conducted research since 2019. And today, they will present their findings. The issues to be discussed are, among others, the roots of Indonesia's resilience against violent extremism, Malaysia, the state overzealous and strong role, and an overview combating extremism. These topics are very relevant to our region as there is a need for assessing how states responded to various kinds of extremism in Southeast Asia and provide policy recommendations. We hope that the findings from this research could deepen our understanding of policy responses, extremist threats to the state's foundations, and contribute to the dialogue on containing extremism in the region. I look forward to listening to the researchers' presentation, and I would like to thank GRIPS and RSIS and all the researchers for their continued cooperation with CSIS. Lastly, I would like also to thank all of you who joined us today. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Pak Jusuf Wanandi. Now, I'd like to invite Ambassador Yutaka Iimura, Senior Fellow at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, or GRIPS, in Tokyo. And Ambassador Iimura, we know that he was also the former ambassador of Japan to Indonesia. Ambassador Iimura, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Phillips. Thank you very much for everyone for joining RSIS and the GRIPS Japan jointly. Today, as Philip mentioned, we are having the second workshop to present the outcome of joint research conducted by the Policy Research Network on the Contemporary Southeast Asia, the abbreviation of which is PRN-SEA. This network was established, as I mentioned last time, in 2019, jointly by ASEAN's major research institutions, among others, RSIS Singapore, CSIS Indonesia, ISIS Malaysia, VASS Vietnam, and Japan's GRIPS, to study the challenges we are facing in the region. The project consists of three kinds of activities. Number one, annual conference. Number two, joint studies. And number three, now with COVID-19 limiting cross-border human exchanges, monthly or bi-monthly webinars with variety of topics related to our region. Regarding joint studies, researchers from ASEAN and Japan have been working already more than a year on the 5 topics as follows. Number one, great power rivalry and maritime order. Number two, state response to extremism. Number three, sustainable economic growth. Number four, development cooperation partnership. Number five, environment. Most of the research clusters will conduct online presentations during the course of March, after which they will come up with written papers or publications being enriched by the discussion we will have following the presentation. Today, we hear the presentation on state response to extremism. Extremism, particularly religious ones, has been drawing attention already for decades in the region. Today, presenters will talk about, among others, the issues like what are the origins of this renewed extremism? How have they been organized? Have we been successfully confronting the challenges? What about the role of the states in the region confronting the extremism, and among others? Now we look forward to hearing from the members of clusters. Thank you very much. The floor, yes, Phillips, thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Iimura. Now, we are going to start the presentation of the 5 researchers. And I'd like to remind the speakers that we only have a very limited time for 5 speakers. So please limit yourself into 10 minutes So we will have enough time for a discussion later on. To set the tone, I'd like to invite Professor Takeshi Kohno, Professor of Political Science at Toyo Eiwa University in Japan, to provide an overview on how to frame religion matters before the other four researchers present their papers. Takeshi Kohno, san, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Let me share the presentation here, then start. I hope you can see the screen here. My role is to provide the overview of what we found regarding the state's role in combating extremism. Let me start the main argument. So I emphasize here that how to frame the issue really is important because it shapes the policy responses. The framing means to locate a particular issue or social issue in a place so that the issue is understood only in that particular location, not from different perspectives, but the framing really sets the tone of the area where state as well as society debates the issue. And the Islamic extremism is framed as a religious issue or a racial issue. It really makes a big difference. And I argue that the Malaysia and Singapore frame Islamic extremism as a racial issue, and Indonesia and the Philippines frame Islamic extremism as a religious issue. What's the implication for the policy responses? Once you frame the Islamic extremism as a religion, faith and practices acutely, it's a personal issue, and the state policy intervention into personal realm is very difficult. As a result, the state's policy scope is limited. So when you look at the distinction between private and public, it's difficult for state to intervene in the private area. But once it's public, it is very maneuverable to intervene. Probably typical example is like a traffic laws. It's a very, very public issue, so the state can regulate. But once you frame religion as frame extremism as a religion, it's a personal faith issue, and the practices is very difficult for state to intervene. On the other hand, religious extremism is framed as a racial issue. Interracial relations are matters. It's a public issue. And the state's policy intervention in its public realm carries many policy tools. For example, preferential investment or housing and zoning policies. So as a result, state policy scope is broader than above case of extremism as a religious issue. Here we compare 4 countries that you will hear from each speakers in a more nuanced way, but let me just categorize in terms of how to frame the extremism issue. So Indonesia, as you know, it's a very massive country, and legal status of Islam is recognized in the constitution, among others. And the state's influence or scope over Islamic affairs, including combating extremism, it's rather limited, because Indonesia treats extremism as a religious issue. But there's a unique character in Indonesia's religious experience, which is most of the Islamic issue is managed through mass religious organizations. And this is the social character where Indonesia really distinguishes itself from others. But still, Indonesia treats religion as a personal issue. And it is very clear from the kind of series of elections that Indonesia experienced. The Islam is treated as a tool for power struggle because it really touches on the personal belief, and it's a drive for making groups for political purposes. So therefore, politicians as well as those leaders often use religion as a political tool. So there's, of course, danger for democratic governance. The more democratic it gets, the more antagonistic for the state to manage those religious issues. Malaysia's state influence is much broader. It's framed as interracial relations and managed by state apparatus. And this has something to do with those racial riots that Malaysia experienced in 1960s. So the socially, as well as from the perspective of the state, extremism or religious extremism issue is framed within the interracial issue. And it doesn't mean that Islam became the kind of tool for political competition. It did, but it's within the political elites amongst Malays. And the Philippines, the scope is very limited. The state is constitutionally barred to intervene in personal faith. There's a clear separation between church and state in the constitution. And the regionally concentrated Muslim issues, which turns into a separatism often, really complicates the state policy responses. And Singapore is also state, similar to Malaysia, state influence is much broader. And the extremism issue is framed as an interracial issue and managed by state apparatus. Given the small physical size of the Singapore, I think the government is very sensitive in managing the religious matters within the framework of the racial relations. To respond to extremism, this limited or broader role of the state really matters. For Indonesia, because the state influence is limited, responding to, for example, 9/11, it was very slow. And the political struggle amongst different political parties complicated its response. So initially, President Megawati at that time did not respond effectively. Meanwhile, the her vice president, stated that 9/11 was the response to, in quote, the sins of United States. Malaysia response was initially it was slow, but it was very effective later on and fast once it's recognized. As I mentioned, Malaysia, amongst the Malay elites, there was a power struggle based on who should be more Islamic. And this treatment of Islam initially really ignored the penetration of foreign intervention. The Philippines, as I said, is very slow, and it's very difficult to respond because of it's a separatism issue and then regionally concentrated. And Singapore is the same as the Malaysia, except that, that there is no power struggle over Islam amongst the other governing elites. So let me just conclude here the challenges in policy recommendations. I see the huge challenge is the state's role is challenged by sophisticated social media penetration into youth, especially, and such penetration is very global. For Malaysia and Singapore, it's better to continue maintaining the state legitimacy in managing religious extremism via racial lens, but the youth generation in these two countries with diverse interests and skills may not necessarily agree with this approach. So the state really needs to manage the racial harmony and then try to gain the support from the younger generation. For Indonesia, I think it's continued to be the mass religious organizations such as Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah, as an example, continue to be the receptor and the dispatcher of religious ideas. Hence, these organizations need to assist the state to combat extremism. For the Philippines, the most complicated case, the state's reliance on religious organizations to combat extremism is marred by distrust. Hence, the state needs to increase public trust in many years to come. So I think the Philippines case is a very, very complicated one. And as the data shows, the incidence of religious extremism in the Philippines is much higher compared to other 3 states in this research. Thank you.
Thank you, Takeshi-san, and thank you for starting the discussion by analyzing the framing of this issue in the 4 countries that are under studies. And I think we are going to have a very good discussion on this, because certainly the issue of state and religion relations in Southeast Asia in particular are very important and affecting so many other sectors within the societies of these 4 countries. Now I'd like to invite our second speaker, Dr. Jamhari Makruf. He's the advisory member at the Center for Islamic and Social Studies, Syarif Hidayatullah State Islamic University in Jakarta. His presentation is titled "The Roots of Indonesia's Resilience Against Violent Extremism." Professor Jamhari, the screen is yours. 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, moderator. First of all, I would like to thank you, RSIS, CSIS, and GRIPS for having this research and also webinar. And secondly, I would like to thank you to the Center for the Study of Islam and Society, or Pusat Pengkajian Islam dan Masyarakat, State Islamic University, for allowing me to use all the data for my studies. And also, of course, I was helped by Testriono in doing this research. So my presentation today title is "The Roots of Indonesia's Resilience Against Violent Extremism." Next. So violent extremism here, of course, there are a lot of definitions, but I used refers to an ideology that advocates strategies to generate system transforming extreme solution for government and society through violence and non-democratic means. Next, Takeshi. So this is a question that we pose in our research, that how Indonesia managed and also handle the threat of violent extremism in Indonesia. Of course, Indonesia still terrorism is a threat to Indonesia. The country has seen various violent groups wax and wane over the time. In 2020, even during the pandemic COVID, a difficult time, there were about 220 people were detained by the Indonesian police because of the violent extremism. And Global Terrorism Index, published by the Institute for Economics and Peace, places Indonesia in medium level index with 4.6 out of 10, meaning that there is still a danger of terrorism attack in Indonesia. The index shows that although Indonesia still faces terrorism, but Indonesia has built a strong foundation of resilience against terrorism. Next. So why violent extremism still a threat in Indonesia? Some people use the phrase, the same old goes. So the violent extremism group will recurrent and reemerge again and again with different name, with different organization. Since the beginning of our independence, there were a lot of organizations use violent extremism for their purpose and for their goal. The clandestine movement and recruiting process by Jama'ah Islamiyah, this is the old terrorist group of Indonesia, still continue until recently. So there are some process and sub-movement by Jama'ah Islamiyah to recruit new members. Some splinters group which broke away either from Darul Islam, this is the early movement of violent extremism using Islam, or from Jama'ah Islamiyah, and small cells with no organizational affiliation have continued to emerge. Some Indonesian terrorist leaders, extremist leaders, now have declared their loyalty to ISIS. So this is like there is a continuation of violent extremism in Indonesia since the emergence of ISIS. Next. So I would like this research. I would like to see how Indonesian institution, political institution, and also values of Indonesia and civil society organizations contribute to Indonesia's resilience against violent extremism. I will focus on four things. One is the Pancasila, the 5 pillars, the 5 principles of Indonesia that become the guidance of Indonesian politics and also people in the interaction. The second is the relation between state and religion. The question of the relation between religion and state is very important to ask question on that. And the third one is democratic multi-party system. And the fourth one is moderate Islamic mass organization, such as NU and Muhammadiyah, how they play their role in combating violent extremism in Indonesia. Next, Takeshi. So Pancasila, basically 5 principles, believe in one God, humanitarian, and third is unity of Indonesia. Fourth is representative democracy, and 5 is social justice, become the state philosophy and ideology of Indonesia. This has become compulsory of Indonesian organization to use Pancasila as their base. So I think this is a good basis for Indonesian to be united. The third one is Pancasila has been understood and agreed as a common word, sacred agreement as our nation among our people to build Indonesia safe and peaceful. So Pancasila is sacred agreement for Indonesian people. And Pancasila actually is stating, and also we can learn from the 5 principles, explain that Indonesia is not secular state nor a theocratic state. So it's a middle. Late Professor Bahtiar Effendi named Indonesia as religious state. So not we are using secular system, but also aspire the religious values in our state. And fourth one, Pancasila also guarantee religious pluralism. So this is an excellent example that Indonesia guarantee the religious pluralism for any religion in Indonesia. As we know that Indonesia is multi-religious and multi-ethnic, the existence of Pancasila, which guarantee religious pluralism, is a good and also is a very important for Indonesia. And fourth one, Pancasila is the constitutional foundation. So I think it is agreed that any organization, any movement in Indonesia should place Pancasila as their basis. So basically, this is a strong foundation for Indonesia to be moderate. Next. Now I would like to move to the second issue, the state and Islam relationship. From the beginning, Indonesian approach is using the accommodationist approach. I give you some several examples how state accommodates the Islam in their strategies. One is enact several laws applicable only to Muslims, such as Islamic court, Hajj, Islamic banking, zakat, and waqf. Secondly, Indonesian state also established the Minister of Religious Affairs, though it is for all religious affairs, but basically you see the rules and also the program of Ministry of Religious Affairs, 90% of them relates to Muslim affairs. Third one, religious education beside public education. Indonesian government acknowledge that religious education is a basic entity separated from public education. The fourth one, the accommodationist state concerning Islam has to some extent shown the success of political actors in moderating Islam by taking some aspects of Sharia and adopting them for the Indonesian context. So this is the success of moderating Islam in Indonesia. So next, the multi-party system. This is the democratic multi-party system, although probably not many of you will agree with me. I think political party system is a good for open political aspiration. So any people and any different group can aspire, can use the political movement as their aspiration. So for me, a multi-party system diminishing unconditional effort pursued by those extremist groups, rather than they are using clandestine, rather than using their streets or unlawful inspiration. I think multi-party system provide them a democratic opportunity for them to aspire their political aspiration through normal and also good procedure. The lack of political representation in democracy can endanger the political system and pave the way for the process of radicalization. Next, the third one, this is the important one, is the existence of Muhammadiyah and NU. Muhammadiyah and NU are both vibrant civil society organizations. NU has 60 million followers and Muhammadiyah has 30 million followers. This number is changeable, depend on who saying this, but at least that Muhammadiyah always half of the NU followers. Second, Muhammadiyah and NU has educational network across the country. The NU has a lot of pesantrens across the country, which become the basis for teaching moderate adopting local Islam in their teaching. And Muhammadiyah has more modern Islam school throughout the country, which are trying to combine to integrate between modernity and Islam. Three, Muhammadiyah and also become supplement to the state. This is evidence to their education, health system, and social service they provided for Indonesian people. Muhammadiyah has a lot of hospitals and also education that help supplement the hand of government to the Indonesian people. Both Muhammadiyah and NU, both moderate religious organizations, rejecting extremism and destructing Islam. Where civil society stands and citizens join more of these voluntary groups, extremist group will not find the fertile ground to grow, meaning joining NU and Muhammadiyah has both internal effects on individual citizen and external impact on the polity. Next. The conclusion, the Pancasila state has consistently been put forward as the alternative to an Islamic state. It has been a foundation for the proper relationship between the state and Islam, where Indonesia is neither a secular nor an Islamic state, while at the same time closing the door to effort to adopt a caliphate system inspired by extremist groups. Second, the accommodationist relation of Islam and the state have led to the emergence of an inclusive state that can bind Indonesian diversity. Third, multi-party elections allows various groups, including Islamic groups, to be involved in politics and express their aspiration constitutionally and thus reduce the appeal of Islamic State propagation. Finally, NU and Muhammadiyah represent vibrant civil society supporting the war on terror orchestrated by the Indonesian national government. Both organizations exhibit social capital essential to countering the extremist ideology. Extremist group will not find the fertile ground to grow as long as NU and Muhammadiyah continue their role as moderate civic associations of most Muslims in the country and support the government system. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Jamhari, and thank you for the interesting presentation on the 4 factors that provide the moderating effects of the religious society within Indonesia, and that I think will be a subject of discussion later on during the Q&A. Now I'd like to move to our third speaker, Dr. Kamarulnizam Abdullah, National Security Professor at the Universiti Utara, Malaysia, to present the case of Malaysia. Dr. Kamarulnizam, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Phillips, the chairperson. My name is Kamarulnizam, actually not Kamarulnizam. Sorry. Members of the panels, and also thank you very much to CSIS, RSIS, and GRIPS for kind of hosting and sponsoring this kind of project. I have 10 minutes, so I have to talk very fast on the Malaysia and the states of overzealous and also strong. So my focus is basically on the dynamism of state-Muslim relation in a multiracial society in the context of religious terrorism threats. The major arguments of this paper is that number one is state maintains protective role, overzealous role in defending of Islam through law and its enforcement. What I meant by overzealous is basically is overprotecting of Islam in Malaysia by providing authority defined Islam based on traditional Sunni adherence, and also rejecting any new opposing ideas that deem incompatible in that sense. So that's why Sunni is, but although it's not defined in the constitution, like what Takeshi has mentioned just now, Islam is part of the constitution as the official religion of the country, but Sunni never be made as a kind of an official sect of Islam in Malaysia. But there are, a kind of current moments that moving toward that pushing the government to put Sunni as an official interpretation of Islam in Malaysia, because they are very concerned. They see Shia as a kind of a threat, and Shia in Malaysia is considered a kind of deviant teachings in the context of our multiracial society. But that overzealous role is basically hard on, but it is kind of having a kind of double effect, meaning that it created more demand for Islamism. It doesn't create a kind of a situation that we wanted, but it has a backfire effect on the Malaysian situations. And my other major argument is that current religious terrorism threats pose threats to threats and opportunity to Malaysia in terms of that first, radical Salafism in the form of the Wahhabi ideas is incompatible to the state defined of Islam in Malaysia. But the problem is some are attracted, especially the younger generation, to these new ideas because it's promoting a new idealism of Islam. And there are what they call it theological war or debates who has the right Islam, that what Takeshi has mentioned. How it evolves, why Islam is having a kind of a, why state has a kind of a strong role in Malaysia. We need to look at how Islam has expanded in Malaysia. First, it's a strong role by the royal court and aristocrat before, whereby that the Sultan, has been an institution as a symbol of authority, the defender of the religion. So religion during that time was a unity factor, that is symbol of subject obedience to the sovereignty of Sultan. Then during the colonial period, British never involved in the Islamic affairs of the countries, and the power of Islamic affairs was kind of handed over to the individual state within the colonial federation system. This kind of structure continue in the post-colonial period, whereby that it have a structural maintenance, but with some complication, especially when we are living in a very broad multiracial society. You have a problem of conversion issues. Who has the right for conversion? Can Muslim become can be converted to non-Muslim religion and all that? And we have now the current debate is the use of the word Allah, God. For the Muslim, it is a kind of trademark of the Muslim and cannot be used by other Muslim. Whereby that the federal court disagree and decided that any religion can use the word of Allah on that stance. So, but at the end, I still maintain that there's a traditional Islamic character, that has been challenged several times, and Malaysia basically is moving toward another direction, which for me is a kind of worrying development in the Malaysian context. So the coming of new ideas, sometimes we call it radical, extreme, it depend on the period of itself. The first wave was brought by the Salafi ideas. Middle Eastern graduates influenced by the reformists of the Rashid Rida and Muhammad Abdul. They call for the reform in the Islamic management system in Malaysia administrations. So we have a reform from the Pondok, we call it in Indonesia pesantren, to the madrasah system, more structured of educational system. But interestingly, madrasah during that time become the center of nationalist, movement during the pre-independent period. What that the reformers or the new Salafi ideas brought in was that Islam, during that time was perceived as a corrupted, by cultural norms and adat, and they advocated religious purity, and this kind of situation created a kind of debate between what they call it the old guard between the traditionalist administrator of the religious affairs and also the new Turks or the reformists. The second wave is quite interesting, and which basically is what we have now is basically as a continuation of this second wave, although we have the third wave on these ideas. This is a kind of, for me, is a Iranian revolution versus Saudi Wahhabism. There was a kind of competition between the two, that Saudi did not want, Shi'i ideas to be expanded to the Sunni-dominated countries. So they embarked a kind of expansions, through the petrodollar, which carry Wahhabism in the process. So it was a kind of cultural influence. We see a kind of the Islamic revivalism, what do you call it? Some people attribute it to the Iranian revolution, but you must also remember that the culture, that kind of cultural revolution, the Islamic revivalism, is also being part of Saudi expansionism of Wahhabism during that time. So in terms of cultural influence, hijab was a kind of the normalcy in Malaysia. There was a Saudi Culture Center, and the scholarship was offered, especially in the Medina University, whereby the thousands of Malaysians from the madrasah, religious schools, were sent through the Saudi scholarships, to study in Medina. So its consequence is very vast, basically, on this kind of matter. And at the same time, Malaysian also sent to Pakistan and Indian madrasah school, whereby that this school basically was associated with the Saudi early focus in Southeast Asian expansionism. So the consequence is basically the Islamic revival phenomena, the mushrooming of Salafi-based Muslim movement people. There was Al-Arqam, what they call it, Abim and others, and the expansion has been, the backbone of religious school, whereby that is also a kind of the venue in the later part of the expansion of Jemaah Islamiyah regional operations. And at the same time, the consequence also, we can also look at the consequence in the Islamization of public school. Morning prayers using Islamic verses and all that. And this is also the beginning of the non-Muslim and non-Malays, numbers of students, the reduction, the reduction of admission of non-Muslim, non-Malay student in the public school, because they see it as a kind of the Islamization of public school in Malaysia. Ironically, state reaction to become more Islamic by introducing Islamization process, the inculcation of Islamic values in the government. This is very true during the Mahathir period, but it also added the expansion of Wahhabism in Malaysia. The more, what they call, quote unquote, pure understanding of Islam in Malaysia. So it ended up more demand for Islamism. Malaysian Muslim become more conservative on that sense. So there's a political rivalry, what Takeshi said, who is more Islamic among the major Muslim parties. And there are also extreme incidents, that there are also attacks on some government installation, police officers and all that, like Mamali and also Batu Pahat. So what they did during that time, they enforced the preemptive law, like the Internal Security Act, Emergent Ordinance, to contain this kind of expansionism. And then we have a third wave. This is what I call it, the manipulation of Neo-Salafism. This is the consequence of September 11th, and also the global expansion of Wahhabism beyond the border. That it become more internationalized. The networking become more vast. It has been expanded through Islamic education system, and unfortunately, it has been appreciated by the society. It has been accepted by the society as part of the norms. That kind of purity. Although sometimes, the value that has been bring in by this group, is incompatible with the local cultural value. Why I say this is a kind of a manipulation of Neo-Salafism is a kind of political expressions, reinterpreting of jihad from the Ummatic inner struggle to open physical war. It's a Neo-Salafism. And you can see that this is, the involvement of Malaysian in Al-Qaeda, anti-American jihad, and the involvement of Malaysia in the setting up of Al-Qaeda regional link in the Jemaah Islamiyah. So in the third wave, when the third wave continue, we have ISIS, whereby ISIS is a kind of a different from Al-Qaeda, because ISIS is offering a kind of theological debate of Islam, which, states and also all the Islamic organization has to counter narrative this kind of extremist idea. So this is contesting debates offered by foreign religious inclined terror groups. It has been rejected by the majority of madrasah and religious school because of is a Neo-Salafism kind of idea, which is incompatible to the original Sunni ideas of Islam. But unfortunately, it's attracting young generations with desire to quick change, that have emotionally manipulated, low self-esteem, have a family marriage and all that. And they propagate a kind of Salafi jihadi ideas based on Ibn Taymiyyah. I don't want to go to the what they call the theological debate, but what I can say that what beyond ISIS, that Wahhabism have made more inroad into the Malaysian social culture and political fabric. Those are coming and graduated from Madinah School now, from 1970s and 80s, now become a senior officer in many government offices, and some become muftis, some become a minister. I don't want to mention that, but they have influence. They are using social media to influence a new idea of Islam, Salafi in Malaysia. They also form a part of the political parties. Some of the Salafi inclined members, they join UMNO, they join Bersatu and all that. This is, for me, is a kind of worrying development in Malaysia. So how to neutralize the threats? Again, state play an important role there, but state cannot use the preemptive laws. They cannot use force on that matter. You can use the legal approaches, catch them and all that. But since ISA was repealed in 2000, I want to say 2012, we have another preventive law, POTA and POCA. But the government, agree that when you're talking about how to counter the extremist argument, we have to neutralize them through rehabilitations, law enforcement rehabilitation. So because we are facing with theological warfare, we need to debate, where part of the theological debates are not congruent with the local understanding or also even the basic understanding of Islam. I think Indonesia also, doing that kind of rehabilitation, and also in the context of Singapore. So what they call it is a kind of transformational approach, but that when you are talking about law enforcement, there must be a kind of elements of rehabilitation, and also the involvement of civil society in part of the rehabilitations. That we need to have ulama to debate with them, to change their mindset about what really Islam really means. So way forward, I think that number one, Salafi ideas in the form of Wahhabism has encroached Malaysia in the social political structure. It's iterating ideas through simple explanations in traditional media and social media. It has been brought in by Middle Eastern graduates and also Muslim student activists, from Western universities. They have been inclined to these kind of ideas. They have their own religious gathering and all that, and they bring in all these issues, and also the infiltration of ideas in the religious department and the Malaysian politics. So there is, and there are, since I'm now involved in the National Action Plan on violent extremism, that we need to look at the intense theological debates between traditional Sunni, the establishment, versus the Salafi, the modern one. They call it the modernists, but basically they are bringing a kind of Wahhabi idea. So I conclude my presentation in terms of, giving a kind of question mark. Malaysia is Salafi Wahhabi in making. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kamarulnizam, for your presentation and for providing us with interesting case of Malaysia, where overzealous role of the states actually creating more demand for Islamism, and then also the various historical junctures that creating forces within Malaysia to become more and more Islamist in their outlook. Now, I'd like to invite our fourth speaker, Dr. Norshahril Saat. He is a senior fellow, coordinator of the Regional Social and Cultural Studies at the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies, Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. Dr. Saat, the screen is yours. 10 minutes.
Thank you, Philip. And special thanks to GRIPS, CSIS, and also RSIS for organizing this. In the interest of time, I'll keep my presentation very brief, and I'll be discussing on Singapore. So the title of my presentation is Singapore, a case of a strong and a resilient state. And I'll be talking about how the state and society responds to extremism. Next slide, please, Takeshi. So this will be the outline of my presentation. It's actually similar to the paper which I've submitted to the organizers. First, I'll be talking about Singapore society and politics in general, and then I will look at state-Muslim relations. Here, I'll be looking at the case of a strong state. What do I mean by a strong state? It's normally associated with a negative connotation, but what I'm trying to say here is the effectiveness of the state in tackling extremism and how society responded to the state's plans. The third and fourth points, I will look at some of the issues related to extremism, mainly governance-related issues. And increasingly, society has been demanding for alternative institutions to challenge the existing order. And this is, of course, borrowing from what the previous presenter has spoken about the rise of Islamic revivalism. We also see the impact in Singapore. I will conclude by looking at 2 points, mainly one is the international dimension, whether we are really looking at Arabization of Singapore society, where we always talk about the Middle East influence, or are there other influences? And I will conclude by looking at what is the future of state-society relations. Are we seeing a strong state still going forward, or are we seeing a state that is being challenged? Next slide, Takeshi. So generally, Singapore society, when you talk about the Muslims generally make up 15% of the 5.6 million people in Singapore. It's a minority case, unlike in Malaysia and Indonesia. But there's a close association, a close nexus between religion and ethnicity, because majority of the Muslims in Singapore are the Malays. And Singapore, in a way, the way it's framed, and this is also a colonial legacy, ethnicity becomes a very important marker, and it's shaped many of the policies and even the political and social systems in Singapore. So when we talk about Singapore system, we always talk about the CMIO, where we talk about racial categories. Chinese being the most dominant ethnicity in the country, followed by Malays, Indians, and the rest. So technically, the Malays make up 13.4% of the Singapore population, and majority of them are Muslims. Next slide, Takeshi. So when we talk about issues, what exactly does the Singapore government and society represent? I think the core tenets of the state are meritocracy, it means equality of every group, multiculturalism, and when it comes to religious issues, secularism. That means the separation of state and religious affairs. But when we talk about secularism here, we must also bear in mind that certain institutions are allowed to exist in Singapore. Every religious groups are allowed to practice their religions freely. And for the Muslims in particular, and this is of course a colonial legacy as well, we have the Administration of Muslim Law Act, which clearly ensures that the institutions related to the Muslim community in terms of mosque building, Islamic bureaucracy, and marriages and divorces, the courts continues to exist in Singapore. So this is quite a unique case of secularism, but at the same time, religious institutions are allowed to exist. Next slide, Takeshi. I took a slightly political science comparative politics approach in my paper when we talk about the notion of the state, because I don't want to simply brush off a state as one entity that is homogeneous. We must understand there are different parts of the state. There are different mechanisms of the state. There are, of course, different elites in the state. So in the past, Singapore has always been characterized as a liberal democracy, authoritarian or semi-authoritarian, but I tend to question that. Is that the case? And secondly, Singapore has been identified as a strong economic tiger alongside South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, and Hong Kong. And hence the better approach to understand the Singapore state is to look at what Francis Fukuyama talked about, which is state capacity. And here, when we talk about a strong Singapore state, we're not talking about authoritarianism. We're talking about the effectiveness of the state to carry out its policies, the effectiveness of the state to cajole the people to support its policies. So I think Francis Fukuyama's state capacity approach is useful here. Next slide, Takeshi. So the goals of the Singapore state is very clear. I mean, it talks about survival, it talks about security. Its legitimacy relies very much on economic growth, and it promotes race and religious harmony, and it's willing to intervene in any way if, let's say, race and religious harmony is being compromised. And hence, when we look at state capacity of the Singapore government, we can say that in terms of technical capacity, the ability of the state to implement policies or come up with good policies is very strong. Institutions, laws and order, very strong. Administrative capacity, the bureaucracy, the effectiveness in carrying out rules and regulations, very strong. And this includes in the religious sense as well. We can say that in terms of political capacity, I think the Singapore government too can be seen as strong. But there's a caveat here. And I think the previous speakers have also talked about currently how states are being challenged. The rise of social media, the rise of democratic movements in the region. So there are many forces at play here. So in terms of political capacity, I think we want to put it as a question mark. And issues are evolving in Singapore as much as is evolved in other parts of the world. Next, Takeshi. So in terms of extremism, Islamic extremism, Singapore is not excluded from the terrorist threat or global radical movements. As what was discussed by my previous two colleagues, the 911 had impacted Singapore as well. We saw the rise of Jemaah Islamiyah terrorist networks that planned some attacks in Singapore, being thwarted, of course, by the state, and again, a demonstration of its state capacity. And of course, lately, we also have the ISIS threat, which of course we saw many of these perpetrators being detained under the Internal Security Act. But when we talk about radicalism or states' responses to radicalism, we must also remember that the state could not have acted alone in tackling radicalism. Society also played a role in tackling and combating radicalism. And I think the state should also be recognized in its use of soft power, in terms of its diplomacy, in terms of its outreach, in terms of its reaching out to society, civil society organizations, to carry out inter-civilizational dialogues or interfaith dialogues. For instance, recently there was another detention of a young boy, mainly planning to carry out attacks against another religious community. Of course, the state intervened in it, but it also encouraged inter-civilization dialogue amongst the religious elites, interfaith dialogue. So there is somehow a combination of states and society's approach to combating radicalism and extremism. Next slide, Takeshi. But I think when we talk about extremism, we tend to focus a lot about terrorism. And this is something that we want to highlight going forward in our next projects. And we want to also look at non-violent extremism. And this is in particular interesting because of the social media, what is being perpetrated, because we cannot make the distinction between violent extremism and non-violent extremism. Where people are questioning secularism, people are becoming more assertive of their Islamic identity, people demanding for alternative, and of course later, eventually, it will lead up to questioning the legitimacy of the state, even though it starts with soft issues like halal fashion or tudung sensation or the hijrah movement. But if we are not careful, this may be escalated and certain groups may ride on this and promote violent extremism. So going forward, I think we also need to look at non-violent extremism as something that we need policymakers to tackle. Next slide, Takeshi. And another issue that I want to tackle is the international dimension, because a lot of talk has focused on the Middle East influence, Salafism, Muslim Brotherhood, Shiism. For Singapore's case, this is definitely a concern for policymakers, but there are also other issues and other sources of extremism, mainly from Singapore's neighboring countries. There's a lot of influence from Malaysia and Indonesia, which needs to be analyzed further. And of course, the social media influence and how it's impacting the religious life of the Malays in Singapore. So these are, again, areas that we need to look at, and hence we need to question whether it's still Arabization or is it the region also plays a part in promoting extremism. Next slide, Takeshi. So this slide is mainly trying to say that, I'm very much influenced by the recent literature that questions the state's legitimacy, the state's strength, by looking at people questioning the state now. Right? The state is fragmented, the state is not united, and certain arms of the government is weakened by certain forces. So these are some of the literature and how the literature in the political science has evolved. Next slide. My conclusion, just to reiterate some points, I mean, Singapore state is generally strong in terms of its effectiveness, but we must also look at its use of hard power and soft power. We need to look at extremism beyond radicalism and terrorism. We also need to look at non-violent extremism. And we must also be careful when we talk about the state, because certain parts of the state may be captured by certain groups and may not be as homogeneous as what we used to think. And hence, efforts to de-radicalize society should tackle both violent extremism as well as non-violent extremism. I think I will conclude there, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Saat. And once again, I think so far there have been very interesting presentations and with its own dynamics. And Singapore is certainly one of the cases where we can learn so much because the other countries are looking for a stronger state. But in the end, you are saying that probably it's not about, it's the definition of the strong state that we need. That in the Singaporean case is the effective state in tackling the problem of extremism. We will discuss that later in the Q&A. So for the participant, if you would like to ask questions, please use the Q&A button on your Zoom screen, and you can post your question there. And we can, if we have time, we will entertain the questions. Lastly, but not the least, I'd like to invite Professor Julkipli M. Wadi from the Institute of Islamic Studies, University of the Philippines in Diliman. Professor Julkipli, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Philip. And before moving into my presentation, I also would like to thank the organizers for organizing this webinar. My paper is entitled "Contested State in the Challenge of Violent Extremism in the Philippines." I resonate with the characterizations of Professor Takeshi Kohno on the complicated case as far as Philippine experience is concerned. I would like to take off precisely from that perspective. In fact, that complication, I refer to it as a state's enigma in addressing violent extremism. So this paper would like to surface what I call the preconditions and triggers that lead into the formations of violent extremist groups in the Philippines. I'd like also to scan, at least broadly, both internal and external environments that perpetuate the dynamic of state response and rebellion, extremism, /terrorism. Although I'd like to focus on Philippine state contention with moral struggle, particularly the strand of violent extremism. But for a few references, the case of communist insurgency also has to be mentioned owing to its contesting claim against in the weight it has placed upon the Philippine state. So basically, this paper would like to address two crucial problems. These are why state-society relations in the Philippines spawn the rise of moral struggle in its strand of political Islam and violent extremism. Number two, how preconditions and precipitants of political Islam and violent extremism explain the convergence of both internal and external environment via linkage politics, namely Salafi ideology, funds, and arms. So these problems are precisely framed to address a major characteristics of the rise of extremism in the Philippines, the first problem actually looks at the internal environment in terms of the tensions between society, between state and society. But the second problem also would like to at least scan external environment. How, for instance, ideology coming from the Middle East penetrated the Moro struggle and leading into breakup of Moro movements and eventually the rise of different Islamist groups. In terms of the policy implications of these problems, I'll be mentioning some of them as we move along in terms of what had been done these past several years in addressing not only extremism but the Moro struggle in general. And to dramatize my presentation in terms of highlighting the impact of violent extremism is in the next slide, shown with what I refer to as the chain of unbroken thread of rebellion and violent extremism in Mindanao and the Sulu Archipelago. We could not narrate this thread of violence, but the two cases are important: the war in Marawi in 2017 and the Mamasapano encounter in 2015. Both are intense battles between Philippine security forces and rebels / extremist groups. In the case of Mamasapano encounter, the Special Action Force of the Philippine National Police was led into a dragnet where it was difficult for them to retreat, and they were subjected into what the locals would call a pintakasi. That is the combined forces of rebels and extremists in fighting against the Philippine Philippine police in their attempt to take Julkipli here, the Indonesian terrorists who had been staying in Emayalep camps for years. And it led into the death of what is known as the 44 Special Action Force of the Philippine National Police. In the case of the war in Marawi, it was an intense battle between the armed forces of the Philippines and the combined forces of the Mauti group, the Abu Sayyaf, and the so-called ISIS affiliated groups. But at the end of the day, they were pushed into that enclave where there's no exit. Most of the extremist groups, militants died, but the casualty was immense. That no less than the city was destroyed. These are just two cases in recent expressions of violent extremism in the Philippines that has faced the Philippines. And because of the long history of insurgency and rebellion in the Philippines, it's almost quite difficult to determine the relationship between state response and rebellion / extremism challenges, because it's almost difficult to identify where the beginning of the whole episode started. But at any rate, I tried to decipher or to distill this relationship between Philippine states and its policy with extremism and the way it has impacted in not only in addressing specific threat groups, but in the way, say, decentralization through autonomy has been extended to the Muslims in the Philippines. And there are two levels of contestation between state policy and violent extremism that usually emerge. First, the state is triggered to display its prowess while exerting recognition to moderate rebel groups, allowing them to raise the status of their belligerency that often led to peace deals and establishment of autonomy. Second, not only rebels, extremists contend among themselves, the state is inevitably faced with new enemy that is armed with new ideology, difficult to address until a change of policy or strategy like the radicalization program is extended. And if radicals would accept it, like say the previous MILF, when it engaged in U-turn from being an Islamist group to a, in a sense, a nationalist group when it accepted, joined the peace process and accepted autonomy. But if at all, a swamp of violent extremists could dry up at one point, by sheer coincidence or otherwise, a dialectic could be formed anew as rehash or new group is born, triggering state response, violent extremist challenge once more. So this refers to the cycle of state response and extremism in the Philippines. So what are the results of this cycle? There has been what I call a relative progression of conflicts this past several years. And this conflict seems to display certain dialectic or relationship between state's response and extremist violence. The consequence of which, or there are two consequences of which. One is continuing granting of autonomy to the Muslims, particularly in Mindanao and the Sulu archipelago, on one hand, but there's also the rise of new militant groups on the other hand. And I refer to this sort of polarizing development as a state's enigma. Because on one hand, while the state is addressing the complaints of Muslims in the South, yet in terms of extending autonomy, yet there is a continuing chain of organized militant groups in Southern Philippines. I felt in the next slide, I tried to locate the relationship of state-society relation in terms of Weberian Foucault debate, wherein in the classic Weberian perspective is that the state is the locus of power and authority. Thus, in terms of bureaucratizing state, the state has the power to rationalize political system. Yet, the Foucault perspective is that society is actually the actual source of power and authority, as people are, in a sense, could be agitated to call for social and political change. And in the Philippine experience, there has been two major challenges on Philippine post-colonial order. One is the Filipino communist ideology in its organization, the CPP-NPA, as it is operating nationwide. And the other is the rise of Moro ethno-nationalism, although it is, in a sense, limited mostly to Muslim areas in Mindanao, but both challenges had been in the political limelight, fighting against the state. In the case of the Muslims in the Philippines, it has been categorized as so-called Moro struggle. And this Moro struggle is dictated with a historically entrenched claim and has been translated into a project in terms of advancing the political rights and the struggle for self-determination, especially amongst politically conscious sectors in Mindanao and the Sulu Archipelago. Now, so far, the government attempt to address this is by instituting policies dating back to the post-American period in terms of integrating the Muslims in the South into mainstream Philippine body politic. And it was, the policy was very pronounced. The policy of integration was very pronounced during the Marcos regime, as a number of institutions and agencies and programs had been put in place, like rehabilitation and settlement, granting of autonomy, establishment of a Mana Bank, instituting the barter trade system, creation of Sharia courts, codification of Muslim personal laws, establishment of Southern Philippines Development Authority, and the Ministry of Muslim Affairs that became the Office of Muslim Affairs, and later on changed into National Commission on Muslim Filipinos. And also the state strengthened even more its national ideology and program, and its administration has been quite consistent in projecting such those policies and program. To say the least, succeeding Philippine administration harness
Excuse me, Professor Julkipli, could you wrap up in 1 or 2 minutes?
Sure.
Thank you.
A range of political, military, and economic policies, like, for instance, intensifying military campaign against terrorists, amending the Human Security Act of 2008 into becoming Anti-Terrorism Act in this year. Now, that constitutes as the first part. The second part that we would like to address is to explain what happened to the Moro struggle as a result of the influence of political Islamic ideology from the Middle East. This happens, in my view, through the penetration of Salafi ideology, and wherein leaders of movements themselves, that is the radical movements, had also used the historical basis of the Moro struggle to their advantage. So in a sense, they combine their Salafi ideology into the rhetoric of Moro struggle, thus creating a new kind of a new project on the Moro struggle, which is already dictated by Salafi oriented program and ideology. So much so that the succeeding radical movements after the early group, like the Moro National Liberation Front, as a nationalist group, the succeeding movements were all organized as Islamic or radical movements, like the MILF, the Abu Sayyaf, the Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters, and the Maoti Group. And their leaders were trained in universities in the Middle East. And the irony of it all, the formations of this group was triggered because of the long peace process between the government and the Moro National Liberation Front. This is the one of the consequences, I said, the rise of different extremist groups, and on one hand, the continuing extension of autonomy to the Muslims in the Philippines. So far, there are now 3 autonomous regions or successively changed. The autonomous region in Region 9 and 12, then later changed into Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao, and now the Bangsamoro government. But it's also autonomous government. So this is the effect, as I said, of the impact of the formations of different groups in the Philippines recently. And the most crucial part, apart from the role of ideology, is the transfer of funds from the Middle East, including arms, given the the proliferations of firearms in Mindanao and Sulu. And this has complicated the problems of violent extremism in the Philippines because of these 2 or 3 areas as driving forces, namely the Salafi ideology, funds, and the military. So I think that would conclude my presentations of the subject. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Julkipli. Now, we almost have to end the session, but I think with the permission of the speakers, if I may, we still have some questions that needs to be answered, and then I can group the questions from the audience into one actually, and then if all the speakers could respond to the question. We have question from Ambassador Umar Hadi in Seoul, and also from Mr. Aan Suryana from Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore, that is related with the internet sphere or the social media. Ambassador Umar Hadi essentially asking how the state, how we respond to the state that has the opportunity to employ more intrusive surveillance technology, and then how it will contribute to the tackling of this extremism. And then from Mr. Aan Suryana, more or less the same questions regarding this new arena of ideological battle, that is the internet sphere. How we tackle the extremism problem stemming from the dissemination of discourse of extremism in the internet sphere, and also the persuasion to join the extremist cause through this social media or the internet. Because I think only some of you touch this particular effects of the internet. If I may start with Takeshi Kohno-san, and then followed by the order of the speakers. Just 1 or 2 minutes each.
Okay, thank you very much. I really, frankly, do not know the technological aspect of the surveillance issues. What's important is the how state employs such technology as long as it's available to its population, and it supports the gain the support from the population is more important. In my argument, when the religious extremism is framed as a very, very private issue, it's very difficult for state to intervene. But once it's framed as the more on the for the public interest, such as racial harmony, I think it's easier for the state to gain public support for surveillance purposes. So that's my answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Professor Jamhari, are you still online? Maybe still muted? Oh, freeze. Okay. Let me ask, while we are waiting for Professor Jamhari, let me ask Dr. Kamarulnizam to respond.
Okay, I got it from Alif, Mr. Alif, about what do you call it? How we look at the difference between Indonesia and Malaysia. Malaysia protective kind of approach is basically, number one, I can give three perspective on that. One is the promotion of Islam itself, that encourage Islam to flourish further. That the government sends students to Middle East and all that, encourage the setting up of madrasah, mahad and all that. And this is a kind of the venue for that kind of more demand for Islamism. Number one is there's a kind of perceived threat of other religions. And this is what Takeshi said just now, that you have to look this Islamism from the perspective of racial interactions, the perceived threat of other religion, the expansion of Christianity and all that, that the argument is that Islam is the official religion, but why? The issue of conversion, the issue of kalimah Allah, has been a kind of, not really, championed by the states, And secondly is about the intercommunal factor in terms of Islam is an identity for the Muslim. How they relate their relation with other non-Muslims is very important. And they want to protect their identity because I think if you're talking about, Malaysians, everybody want to consider themselves as Malaysians. But what are the distinct identity of the Muslim? This is Islam. And Islam is an official religion, and that's why, the idea that Islam has been promoted further and further. And sometimes, they criticize the government of not doing enough to that kind of promotion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kamarulnizam. Now, Professor Jamhari is back. Would you respond to the question of, especially on the internet sphere and social media?
Thank you, moderator. Sorry, I lost my connection. I think there are a lot of research done in Indonesia about the effectiveness of cyber surveillance on the violent extremism, and this is like double sword on this issues. One thing that people worried about the surveillance is that will interfere your freedom of speech using the internet. But I think this is also to be aware of that. But we also aware that the extremists is very good in using social media in their campaign, and a lot of research showing that the issue of religious offense in social media almost dominated by, let's say, extremist point of view. So what the government can do is, one is, again, as my presentation said earlier, that we have to strengthen the role of moderate mass Islamic organization and Muhammadiyah and their capacity, so that they are also joining the back wagon in social media, so uploading more good information in internet. I think that's the best way to counter social media rather than surveillance that probably will interfere in our freedom. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Jamhari. Now, Dr. Norshahril Saat, would you like to respond? You are still muted.
Can you hear me? Hello? Yeah. So very quickly, I think the questions are very important. I mean, there was a recent debate in Singapore, particularly Singapore. We have the Trace Together app that allows us to go public, but at least we know where we move, and in case we are in contact with COVID-19 patients. So there was a debate in Singapore about this. So I think we need to balance between protecting the privacy of citizens versus combating public interest in terms of security. So I think for Singapore's perspective, I think we allow freedom of privacy. We respect that. and we have good laws to protect that. But at the same time, I think this data is also necessary for us to combat serious crimes, and terrorism and murder are included as those parts or those aspects as considered serious crimes that I think this data can be used for police investigation. In terms for the second question, this has always been a challenge. That's why in my presentation I talk about state capacity and state effectiveness. But the challenge now is how states, even though states are fragmented, how then the states respond to the online world. So there are different groups. I think there are limitations to the use of laws or institutions, and I think the way forward is, of course, to engage people and to educate people, to encourage the civil society to promote a decent engagement in the public sphere, but highlighting clear guidelines. You know, what are the do's and don'ts in social media? No hate speeches, no discriminatory words against religious minorities. I think this has got to be highlighted. So both states and so civil society has a role to play in combating the online world.
Thank you, Dr. Saat. Professor Julkipli, if you would like to respond as well, 1 or 2 minutes.
I agree with the fact that the role of internet is like a double-edged sword. On one hand, it helps in terms of disseminating information. On the other hand, precisely, it has become a tool of surveillance, and even created some fear amongst populace. I don't think so that each state or the public has really that control. There is I think a structure, a broader structure up there in terms of how internet has been used for as tools of globalization and so on. But in terms of how the state would address or cope with so-called internet fear, I think I agree with the notions of strengthening state capacity and a balanced treatment on freedom and security. And also there has to be some coherence in state policy and government programs, so that there will be some kind of a order in the way policies are implemented on the ground. Next is there has to be high public trust amongst people as far as state in policy and government programs is concerned. Because if there is no public trust, then people could not just be swayed to accept or to agree into any form of government interventions, especially on matters of their privacy and freedom. The next is, I think, strengthening of counter-narrative against violent extremism by harnessing a universal mainstream Islamic perspective. This should not lead into a kind of a clash between, say, the moderate and the radicals, but rather the state has to be sensitive into some kind of allowing them to forge unity in such a way that they would agree, groups and movements on different fence would be able to agree on common definitions and perspective. And finally, after everything is said and done, I think it again goes back to addressing the root cause of why rebellion and extremism has been sustained these past several years, so that if this is translated into reform in sustainable program, then the government would be able to get the trust of the people, and by then the state and society could move forward harmoniously.
Thank you, Professor Julkipli. and thank you for all the participants as well as the experts that have been presenting the papers that are enlightening. If I may borrow your 1 or 2 minutes of your time, if I may, what I understood from the conversation in this webinar, there are at least 4 points, if I may. Number one, the speakers' papers made some reference to various historical junctures within countries in the 4 countries that are under studies. So in a way, it's a problem of the post-colonial problems. B, it's part of the continuous unfinished nation-building processes in these 4 countries. Or C is continued negotiation about the state, society / religion relations. Although in these countries at the constitutional level, it has been resolved since day one of the independence of the 4 countries that we are talking about through the paper. Number 2, that negotiation, quote unquote, space mainly occur because of the different level of state capacity in the 4 countries under study. The political accommodation, the politics of accommodation have been adopted. More autonomy in the case of Southern Philippines, enactment of laws applicable only for Muslims in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, etc. But yet, so far from the papers, what I understood is that we've seen mixed results of this politics of accommodations. In Malaysia, it even created more demand for Islamism, according to Dr. Kamarulnizam. In the Philippines, it's also resulting in the rise of more militant groups, especially in the southern Philippines. While in Indonesia, according to Professor Jamhari, we've seen some moderating effects from the wide-ranging policies, the 4 factors that he've been discussing. But it's also subject for discussion, given what we've been facing in Indonesia in the past 2 or 3 years. Thirdly, international factors cannot be ignored. Because it made some inroads into the countries, the Salafi ideological movement across the globe, and internet sphere from the question from the audience, and social media are also part of the problem and a big challenge that we are facing right now. But lastly, I think the 4 speakers agreed, and the 5 speakers agreed that we at least need a vibrant civil society. So we can, achieve some sort of a high trust society and intercommunal, healthy intercommunal relations within our communities. So I think that's the discussion today. I'm sure the paper would be, if it is done, would be available from the website of the 3 organizations sometime soon. I apologize if we go over time, but I think it's worth it because the papers are well researched, and I think it should be discuss more in another time. Thank you. Now I would like to end the discussion. See you again in the next webinar of CSIS-RSIS and GRIPS sometime soon. Stay healthy and have a good day. Thank you.